I really started getting records back in 1960, and I didn't have a particular preference for style of music or anything yet. I was still too young in this. And I wasn't particularly drawn to some of the real popular music, and I wasn't experienced enough yet to, hear the classical music or anything. My first stereo record actually was on the Hi-Fi Records label, and it was Martin Denny, Taboo. And this was kind of exotic Polynesian Hawaiian music, and for its day, unbelievably well recorded. I listened to it last night after not hearing it for probably 20 years, and I was astounded at how good that thing sounds. Also on the Hi-Fi Records label, there was an organ record that I got called The King of Instruments, the organist Bruce Prince Joseph. These guys would cut big, full-range grooves. Audiophile was also doing that. But at that time, the late 50s through the early 60s, there were actually a lot of pretty good-sounding records. The industry had not become so sophisticated and loaded with toys for, manipulating the sound. I just took it for granted. About that time, too, I started to hear about this renegade magazine called Stereophile. So I started reading that. Some of the stuff seemed pretty outrageous to me. I mean, how is it possible that people would, think that some of these cartridges that couldn't track as well as a Shure could track were any good? I did begin noticing that you could correlate the sound of the record with the geometry of the grooves. Now, of course, analog mastering engineers need to do this all the time. So they're eyeballing the grooves. They usually have a microscope for doing it to make sure that the low-frequency modulations don't cross from one groove wall to the next. And so my friends Don Alley and Frank Thompson and I would go to Tower Records in Sacramento, California, and look at the record grooves and decide which records we were going to get. And that's when I started becoming more and more interested in classical music. I had also had quite an interest in pipe organ music. I think I got that from Don. And then Frank got me really interested in some of the Mercury recordings, which have turned out to be so great. You start realizing that all of these recordings are not sonically equal. And then when RCA brought out the Dynagroove, it was packaged so elegantly. I remember Eric Leinsdorf and his recordings, and I really wanted to like them, and I couldn't listen through a whole album. About that time, too, February of 1963, my Don and I and my parents went to San Francisco to a concert at the Farewell to the Fox. The Fox was this unbelievably ornate, beautiful theater on Market Street, and George Wright was going to be giving the final concert there. It was very memorable and important for me. So I started at that point to try to go and hear live music more and more. And that went on for several years. I didn't actually start recording until 1975, and my wife was involved in a women's choir for our church, and I thought, well, I'm gonna really try to do a good job on this recording. Cheryl said, well, maybe you can make a recording of it, and we can make a few cassettes, and, the gals want some cassettes. So I rented a pair of Sennheiser condenser microphones, and I used my Revox for it, and I had a blast. It was a lot of fun. And one thing led to another, and I found myself the owner of a pair of AKG 414s that I'd purchased from William File. He was a on-location recording engineer for NPR and some of these other organizations. So he had a pretty good sense of sound and microphones and everything. And I also, in 1976, went to a very important for me concert in San Francisco at Grace Cathedral with Jim Welch playing French literature. As I was listening to that, I just thought, I have got to capture that sound. And pipe organs can be pretty challenging to record properly. But fortunately, we built up a friendship. Jim Welch and our friend Craig Good ended up recording a lot of things with Jim Welch. In fact, our first two LPs that we produced, music performed by Jim Welch. The AKG 414 served me well, and not too long after that, I purchased a pair of Shep's CMC 36 microphones. Now, it seems like everything makes a difference, almost regardless of the passion that you have. The more you know about it, the more you realize that little things make a difference. And so over the years, I had learned the difference between the moving coil cartridge versus the moving magnet cartridge, specifically the Audiophile SPE versus the Shure. Cone materials, condenser microphones versus dynamic microphones, microphone placements. And of course, today we understand so much more about that, and we understand so much more about loudspeaker placement. The Marantz 7C tube preamp versus the supposedly technically superior Dyna PAT4. I made that mistake myself. So all of this was going on in the bliss of a hobby. And I had my day job at Cutter Labs, and this was wonderful because I was able to pursue this passion. Of course, we were always undercapitalized, but we had time. And so in learning these things, we also began developing speakers for monitoring. And we had the WAM at the time, but that was too large to transport. So we developed a portable monitor, which became the Watt, and the rest, as they say, is history.